Burrow, Colin. Now, listen, this would be my favorite story of the offseason. It might end up being that. So, according to a beat writer out of Cincinnati, Joe Burrow's unhappiness last season had a major impact on the Bengals front office.
Yeah.
Apparently, throughout the building, there is a sense that Burrow is telling people this is a paramount offseason ahead, adding Burrow just wants a good defense. He doesn't want to feel like he has to be perfect and score 42 points in a single week. So Joe Burrow making noise. Colin, here's the only reason I don't think this is a huge deal. Show me the team that has moved off a superstar quarterback because he wanted out. Because of the way the salaries and the Players Association set up, they can just tag Burrow when he's unhappy and then keep him a second year. So, I mean, Burrow would have to basically quit football to get away from the Bengals. Does he hate it that much? Because he did insinuate he's not having fun.
No, can I throw something at you?
Please.
And this is just, it's a little bit of a theory. So Aaron Rodgers wasn't always, as he was ascending into his stardom, wasn't always distracted guy, taking the summer off guy, I'm going to disappear guy. Aaron became that as Tom Brady and Peyton Manning started stacking Super Bowl trophies and he couldn't get there a second time. And suddenly he sent off this, hey, football doesn't define me. Okay, that's always been. Joe Burrow, and I love Burrow. Joe Burrow, over the last couple years, he goes to Europe. He's into fashion. I'm going to disappear. Joe Burrow is giving off that same Aaron vibe, which is, his contemporaries are getting to Super Bowls, winning MVPs, having playoff success. And I think Joe Burrow, for self-preservation, for his sanity, is saying, I can't define myself by football because it would drive me crazy. Aaron in Green Bay suddenly became, hey, man, I have more to my life than football. And I think Joe Burrow, over the last couple of years, has gotten into fashion, kind of disappears in the postseason. It's not a criticism. I think it's the way to preserve your sanity.
I understand the broader point Colin is making here, and it's not completely off base. There's some validity to the observation. But I also think we need to consider the full context, particularly the injury history. Those of you who follow my content know I discuss my own experiences with injuries quite frequently. And look, I'm not a multimillionaire who can charter private jets at a moment's notice or access unlimited resources for recovery. But there's a profound loneliness that accompanies significant injury, regardless of your tax bracket. A tremendous amount of pain, both physical and emotional. So many moments when you're simply lying in bed, completely alone with your thoughts, and you find yourself contemplating your entire existence. You start thinking about your mortality, about what your life has become, about whether you'll ever feel like yourself again. It's exhausting. It's genuinely exhausting on every level. I think Joe Burrow has always carried a certain element of that superstar celebrity mentality within him. That kind of Joe Cool persona. He's always presented himself as slightly too cool for school, if you know what I mean. That's how he often carries himself, how he interacts with media, how he presents to the world. And that always stood out to me as a notable aspect of his personality. But honestly, that's not the conversation I'm most interested in having right now, because what J-Mac is saying is just 100% wrong. This is actually something that drives me absolutely crazy, and I need to address it thoroughly. Before I dive into this, I want to address Cincinnati Bengals fans directly. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and watch the full-length video. When you subscribe while watching simultaneously, it makes an enormous difference. Views go through the roof. Subscriber counts go through the roof. And I cannot emphasize this enough. This isn't just about chasing views for the sake of numbers. It's not about obsessing over subscriber metrics. It's about creating content that people genuinely want to engage with, content that sparks real discussion, so I can continue producing the best possible Cincinnati Bengals analysis. Content that remains truly unbiased, grounded in reality, rooted in the actual dynamics of this sport. I'm trying my absolute best to make this happen, so please don't forget to subscribe. Now let me explain why this particular narrative drives me crazy. I've been seeing a similar pattern emerge in conversations about Jalen Hurts recently. Someone floated the idea of trading him, and people immediately responded, but he has a no-trade clause. And I'm sitting here thinking, people are so incredibly uninformed. They don't bother doing even basic research before forming strong opinions. That always frustrates me. And this whole thing that J-Mac has now brought up is essentially an extension of that same ignorance about how the NFL actually operates. Here's the reality, folks. If teams want to move on from a player, or if players want to move on from a team, there are always pathways. These guys make so much money. They carry such immense weight within locker rooms. They possess such gravitational force within organizations. If Joe Burrow walks into the Bengals front office and says, "I want out. Get me out of here," the Cincinnati Bengals aren't going to respond with, "Well, you're under contract, so we're keeping you here against your will. We'll franchise tag you. We'll do whatever it takes to prevent you from leaving." That's simply not how it works in the modern NFL. It's just not the way these situations unfold. If Joe Burrow genuinely wants out, then it becomes in the Cincinnati Bengals' best interest to move on from him and extract whatever value they can in a trade. They'll be able to make something happen. They'll find a partner. They'll negotiate compensation. They'll figure out a path forward. The same dynamic applies in reverse. Imagine the Philadelphia Eagles decided, "We want to move on from Jalen Hurts. We believe in Tanner McKee as our starter. He's our guy for the next 3 years, regardless of performance. Even if he throws 8 interceptions in 5 games, he's our starter." Jalen Hurts could respond, "Well, I have a no-trade clause. You can't just ship me anywhere." But realistically, he'd say, "All right, I'll waive it. Get me to Indianapolis. Get me to a situation I like." That's how it would work. That's how these situations actually resolve themselves. Maybe it's slightly different if you're a cornerback or a safety, a player at a less impactful position. Then sure, teams might exercise more leverage. But when you have this much gravity, this much impact on the outcome of games, you're not trotting out Joe Burrow every Sunday if he's absolutely miserable and does not want to be there. That's not a sustainable situation. This isn't the Le'Veon Bell scenario where a team can just hold a player hostage. The dynamics are fundamentally different for franchise quarterbacks. It's not the way it works. It's not the way it works. I need to repeat that until it sinks in. So yes, if this upcoming season does not go well for the Cincinnati Bengals, I could easily envision Joe Burrow reaching a point where he simply says, "Get me out of here. I'm done. I'm completely done with this. Get me out." And the Detroit Lions and Los Angeles Rams have demonstrated how you can navigate that kind of transition successfully. They showed how something like that can unfold in a positive direction for all parties involved. Now look, you could argue that the Lions haven't won a Super Bowl yet, so maybe it hasn't fully worked out. But they acquired a quarterback and built a team that can obviously win and compete at a high level. They haven't been at the bottom of the NFL standings. They've been legitimate contenders. It's worked well for them, and it's obviously worked spectacularly for the Rams as well. I'm not sure what opportunities would exist next year if you're scanning the league for potential landing spots. You'd be looking for a young quarterback who's playing reasonably well, but just not quite good enough to justify keeping long-term. None comes to mind immediately right now. But that doesn't mean options wouldn't emerge. The point is that there's always a way. I think there should absolutely be pressure on the front office. There should have been pressure from the very day they drafted Joe Burrow #1 overall. That's how this works. And what really irks me, what genuinely gets under my skin, is when people try to blame Joe Burrow for the organization's failures. They say things like, "Well, he's the one who wanted all these wide receivers." Oh, really? He's the only quarterback in NFL history who wanted talented receivers? He's the only signal caller who preferred having elite weapons? I'm sure that's true. And apparently, that's the reason they can't get their defense organized. That's why they can't draft and develop defensive players. All because they decided to pay Jamar Chase. What about before they were paying those guys? What about all those years before these contracts kicked in? I completely reject that narrative. The idea that paying Jamar Chase and T. Higgins somehow prevents them from building an offensive line, from establishing a consistent running game, from constructing any semblance of a competent defense, it's just nonsense. It's not as if Chase and Higgins are commanding $500 million each against the cap simultaneously. That's not how cap math works. I'm so sick of this nonsense narrative trying to shift blame onto the players. There are actually people out there who want to blame Joe Burrow more than they blame the Cincinnati Bengals organization. That is absolute, utter nonsense. Let me say it one more time for emphasis. Absolute, utter nonsense. And you know what? Even if that were somehow the true foundation of the problem, that still falls on the front office for agreeing to those contracts. They're the ones who signed off on the deals. They're the ones who structured the cap hits. They're the ones who chose not to invest in other areas. You think Patrick Mahomes wanted Tyreek Hill to leave? You think he was sitting in Kansas City thinking, oh, sure, get rid of my number one wide receiver who I've been balling with for years. I'm excited for you to move on from him. Please, I can't wait to see what life is like without my best weapon. There's absolutely no way he felt that way. No chance. And you know what? The Chiefs have been struggling to find that consistent wide receiver presence ever since. They've cycled through options, none of whom have replicated what Hill provided. And you could say, well, it worked out for them. Yeah, it worked out because they had Travis Kelce in his prime. They had Andy Reid. They had Steve Spagnuolo. They built an absolutely elite defense. They constructed an elite offensive line that dominated in 2022, arguably the best line in football. Travis Kelce was arguably the best offensive weapon in the NFL in 2023, having the best year of his all-time great Hall of Fame career. And they had a great defense. Then, in 2024, an even better defense. Literally, the top defense in the NFL. Same thing in 2025. But everyone kept saying, what's wrong with the offense? Patrick Mahomes doesn't look the same. He just doesn't look like himself. And it's like, well, yeah. He doesn't have prime Travis Kelce and prime Tyreek Hill simultaneously anymore. Those things matter for any quarterback, regardless of how talented they are. So you have to be able to navigate these transitions intelligently. Other people might say, well, if they moved on from T. Higgins and freed up cap space, they could build a better team. And maybe that's true. But you have to trust the organization to actually build that team effectively. I trust the Eagles. I trust the Chiefs. I trust the Rams. I trust all these organizations with proven track records. But the Bengals have demonstrated the ability to do that consistently? Since when? When exactly have they proven that? Vin, the pressure is on the franchise. The pressure is on ownership. The pressure is on the general manager. That's where the accountability belongs. I know Joe Burrow has struggled to stay healthy, and sometimes people really try to hold that against athletes. They want to put their feet to the fire for things beyond their control. When you get injured that frequently, when you experience that much bad luck with your body, you're essentially a victim of your own physical circumstances at that point. On one hand, it's always a weird conversation because I often find myself saying, their body is failing them, which sounds strange because that same body also enabled them to earn hundreds of millions of dollars and live a life most of us can only dream about. But it's also simultaneously failing them. So it's a complicated, nuanced situation. But I've said this before, and I'll continue saying it until it sinks in. If the Bengals could just be a better franchise, Joe Burrow could literally be in the GOAT conversation. Obviously, he would need to win Super Bowls, continue competing at the highest level, and stay healthy. But when you drafted Joe Burrow, if you had played your cards right, if you had made the right decisions and caught a little luck from the football gods, we would be talking about Joe Burrow as an undeniable, all-time great. Joe Burrow is genuinely that special. There are two things that have stopped him from being part of that conversation: injuries and the Cincinnati Bengals franchise. People had the audacity to try blaming Joe Burrow for why they didn't make the playoffs in 2024. That take was so egregiously wrong that I had to create entire separate videos just to illustrate how spectacular Joe Burrow was that season. I produced a whole video comparing his statistical output to Patrick Mahomes' MVP season in 2018 and demonstrated that Joe Burrow was actually better. Joe Burrow, in the year he didn't make the playoffs in 2024, was statistically superior to Patrick Mahomes' best regular season. But what was the difference? Patrick Mahomes played for a better team. He had a better coaching staff. He had a better organization surrounding him with talent and strategic support. And people always misinterpret this comparison. They think I'm trying to knock Patrick Mahomes or diminish his accomplishments. No. I'm simply trying to highlight just how truly great Joe Burrow is and how the franchise is failing to support him adequately. That's the real conversation. That's where the pressure needs to be directed. Not these meandering tangents about how he's becoming more interested in fashion, or how his off-field interests might signal something about his commitment. This is the wrong conversation entirely. Or trying to argue that he can't move on because of CBA restrictions or contract structures. There is always a way. There's always a path forward. No matter how much people insist there isn't, oh, too much dead cap money, this or that constraint. Dude, there is always a way. No trade clause? There is always a way. It's 2026. It's the NFL. There is always a way, man. Don't let anyone try to convince you otherwise. So if the Bengals come up short this year, honestly, in many ways, if they don't at least reach the AFC Championship game, you have to ask yourself, what are we even doing here? Because Joe Burrow is that great. And here's the frustrating part, and I'll conclude with this. The margin of error for Joe Burrow is essentially non-existent. He could play a spectacular game, make one bad throw, have one slightly off-target pass, and suddenly the narrative becomes, see, Joe Burrow is the problem. He's not good enough. And I don't think people understand that for some quarterbacks, on some teams, the margin for error is incredibly small. And for the quarterback specifically, it's microscopic. Playing like that, game after game after game after game, is absolutely exhausting. If you've never played sports at a competitive level, the best analogy I can offer is an unhealthy relationship where you constantly feel like you're walking on eggshells. You feel like no matter what you do, you have to be perfect in every moment. Every dinner, every interaction, every time you go out, every conversation with their family. It just feels like whatever you do will be wrong. You'll come home, sit in the car for a moment, and mentally prepare to hear about everything you did incorrectly. It's just exhausting. You feel like you have to be perfect, and anytime you fall short of perfection, you internalize it as confirmation that you're the worst person, that you're awful, that you're terrible. That's how it feels for Joe Burrow. The moment he throws an interception, the moment he loses a game and isn't absolutely flawless, the narrative becomes, yep, you're awful. See, this is why they haven't won a Super Bowl. And then in the same breath, people acknowledge that he's a top quarterback in the NFL. And it's like, yeah, he absolutely is. Those are simply my perspectives on the matter. I'm genuinely interested in hearing your thoughts. What's your assessment of Joe Burrow putting major pressure on the Bengals front office? Do you believe the pressure is warranted? Do you think this could genuinely be his final season in Cincinnati if things don't progress in a measurable, productive way? How do you feel about his increased involvement in fashion and off-field interests? Share your opinions in the comments below. I read every single response, whether you agree with my analysis or you're ready to challenge it. Either way, let's generate some meaningful discussion. Let's engage in some spirited debates. But most importantly, let's keep it enjoyable. And please, if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. We're cultivating an incredible community here, and I genuinely value having you as part of it. My goal is to build something that fosters genuine connection, something we're all truly excited to contribute to. I believe we're making substantial progress toward that vision. Please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. It significantly enhances visibility and supports the algorithm. Thank you so much for your continued support. I'll see you in the next one.